It's been about 3 months since my experience. Since that dreadful day, nightmares festered my dreams, depriving me of sleep. My life is gradually getting back into order, but I still feel that I'm forever tainted. My town was strictly religious, so you'd have difficulty hearing stories about supernatural phenomena like ghosts, demons, and the like. I lived with a roommate at an apartment. Every night at 3 a.m., I would take a nightly jog for exercise. It was always a pleasure feeling the chill of the cold air on my skin when I ran. That all changed one night. I left the apartment as usual and I began my jog. I raced down the pavement and stopped at the stop sign. As I began my sprint back, I stopped suddenly when I heard a low hum. I looked around for the sight of the odd humming and followed the path to a dark alley. The sound became louder. Listening closely to the humming, I realized it was of a nursery rhyme. There were 2 disembodied voices singing in unison. They were of 2 children, both of which were boys. The light from my cell phone illuminated the dark alley, revealing the 2 boys skipping around. I've seen several children at the apartment, and I knew them all off the top of my head, but these 2 kids I failed to recognize. They wore outdated clothing. The patchwork of the clothing was mixed-matched and varied in coloration. They were both roughly around 10 years old, but their clothes were far too large for their frames. They must have felt my glare because they suddenly ceased their humming and skipping. Without a word, the 2 boys dropped their heads, at first from apparent embarrassment, or so I thought. The tension was suffocating. I decided to talk to them so as to break the ice. "What are you 2 boys doing out here this late? Where are your parents?" They didn't respond. I pushed further to them to explain their reasons for playing outside at 3 a.m., mentioning how it was especially dangerous for people their age. Instead, they remained glued there, still as stone statues. Finally, I asked them if they felt okay. It was then that the once static children reanimated. Their movements were awkward and robotic. I looked more closely at their physical features. Their skin was pale and chalky, whiter than the raggedy clothes they were wearing. One had brown hair while the other had light blonde hair. For simplicity's sake, I'll call them Blondie and Brunette. "Hey there, mister," Brunette said. He spoke in a bizarrely monotonous tone. It was unnerving, to say the least. "Why are you and your friend out here so late?" "Take us to your apartment," Brunette answered, completely ignoring my inquiry. It was an odd request. I had just met these 2 boys, and yet he spoke as if we knew each other for years. Blondie didn't respond and merely stood by Brunette. Brunette had a flare of confidence to him that was admirable but disturbing. His toothy smirk didn't help matters. "Are your parents there, boy?" He ignored me once again. "Just take us with you. It won't be that long. We'll go to your apartment and we'll be gone." I was becoming more distraught at his assertiveness. "No, I'm sorry, but I'm not gonna... I feel threatened." Brunette's smirk transformed into a scowl with his movement stiffening. Blondie stared at Brunette, then back at me. It was then that I saw what they were hiding. They both had solid, coal-black eyes. There was no sign of whiteness to the sclera. The light from my phone reflected off their eyes, showing a hollow appearance. Apparently, looking directly at their eyes was enough to enrage Brunette. "Just let us go with you," he said, repeating the same demand over and over. He attempted to speak in a reassuring manner that he and his friend were unarmed, and that they were just kids. The other remained silent during the whole tirade. If I wasn't completely overlooking it, the other one appeared to be terrified of Brunette's bouts of anger. I'm a grown man. I've seen things that don't even faze me anymore. I've seen frail old men get robbed in the streets, hit-and-runs, accidents. And yet these 2 boys, if they even were boys, were sending me up the wall and getting under my skin. Worse, that little Brunette. I sensed he understood fully that he was making me uncomfortable and was relishing in it. I kept staring hypnotically into the endless void that was his eyes. Those dark, mysterious pools that lacked all light. I'm warning you boys, one more step and... That little brown-haired freak grabbed my arm. It wasn't a firm grip, but the boy nevertheless had some strength in it. His touch was cold, deathly cold. Then the itchiness started, and my arm felt as if it had caught on fire and was burning underneath his grasp. Blondie stood by with a befuddled gaze. "Let the hell go!" I managed to scream out. He shook his head and pressed his fingers further down on my arm. The pain seared through my body. My strength was flowing out of me. This boy, no, creature hungrily stared at me. His skin was also transformed. His olive-covered tone took on a lively appearance. Enough was enough. While I would never do this to a real child, I knew on a subconscious level that this was no kid, just a crude parody of one. I gathered up enough force in my fist and slammed it into his face. He fell backward, but the other one caught him. He glared at me with that same deathly expression. It felt like hours until he gathered himself and walked away with Blondie. Freed from his hold, I hesitatingly stared at the path that the two children took. But to my relief, they were gone. I wasted no time to understand why they had suddenly vanished, nor did I remotely care to know. I raced back to my apartment after repeatedly looking behind my back to ensure that they weren't following me. My roommate stirred awake from me slamming the door. "Dude, what's all that noise about?" I was breathing heavily, nearly collapsing from my shortness of breath. "Sorry, man, just got into a little trouble while out on my jog." His eyes shot open at that. "Trouble? Are you okay?" I nodded my head. "Don't worry, it was nothing really." He shrugged his shoulders and resumed sleeping. When I got into my bed, I noticed his pet dog Buster sleeping next to his. As I was nearing sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That fire was still active in my body. I found myself catching what I assumed were glimpses of Brunette staring at me with his heated glare. His rage invaded my dreams, as my dreams were primarily about him repeatedly demanding entry into my apartment room. One dream felt the most real. My eyes were heavy from a day's worth of work. As I was nearing sleep, I smelled a putrid scent fill my nostrils. I can best compare it to the smell of months-old diapers burnt to a crisp with sulfuric acid. When forcing myself awake, I saw him. There, at the end of my bed, was Brunette. He wordlessly stood there as a statue before walking towards me, stopping at my face. He bent down at the side of my bed, his amusement never-ending. He tentatively tapped my forehead with his lifeless fingers. His fingers were clawing into my forehead before I was immediately woken up by my roommate screaming. "What's wrong?" I asked. He was desperately looking around the room under his bed and in the bathroom. He was always cool and collected, but now he was acting in utter lunacy. He grabbed me by the shirt collar and pulled me to his face. "Buster's missing!" I was slow to react because he was still being illogical. "Maybe he walked out of the door last night?" My roommate fumed. "Not in his condition he wouldn't." And he was right. The old pug had his old back legs taken out in a vehicle accident. We agreed to pitch in some money to make missing posters featuring the elderly canine, and we spread them around the block. He also talked me into combining the money he had with mine to promise anyone who found the dog a reward for their cooperation. That wasn't the only odd circumstances that transpired. When I returned home after work, I found my roommate sprawled on the ground. I called for an ambulance as he was going into throes. Somehow, my roommate had developed a curious illness with some traces of the common cold and high fever. Besides that, the exact ailment was unknown. It was unfortunate to see a man like my roommate become so stricken overnight by illness, but there wasn't much we could do. He screamed miserably from his suffering and remained that way for weeks. His body mass melted away until he got into a coughing fit and succumbed shortly after. After my roommate's funeral, notes began to appear in my room. They were written on paper that I'd never seen before, and I was quite certain that my roommate also didn't use it. The first note was deplorable. I've been watching you for a good time while from afar. That moment I touched you, I sensed that there was something special about you. It was from Brunette, of course. On the back of the note was an arrow pointing in a straight path towards my door. It felt as if Brunette was beckoning me to follow it. I tried to fight that urge, but the note was an extension of Brunette and it had that same hypnotic feel to it. I walked outside of my door only to see more notes on the ground. They too were a series of arrows pointing straight. I picked each one up and walked down the path. Some of my neighbors saw me collecting the notes, but didn't say anything about them and left them alone. Eventually, I made my way to the laundry room downstairs. Down there, I found a mutilated corpse of an old animal roadkill. A deer, perhaps? A note read, "I have played with the animal in the big man. Now I want to play with you." My nightmares worsened the more I felt that Brunette and Blondie were staring at me. My sanity was being tested daily. I had since ceased my nightly jog because of my fear of seeing those two boys again. I was developing insomnia from my severe lack of sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, I could only see Brunettes staring back at me. It all reached its boiling point one day when I was fired from my job for coming in because of my insomnia. I was late one too many times. Buster showed up one day, so that was nice. Don't know what happened to him, but he looked terrified. Despite me remaining home at nearly 24/7, a series of accidents started to occur in the apartment. More of my neighbors had reported strings of bad luck. A window washer fell 2 stories to his death when his rope broke under mysterious circumstances. More pets were disappearing from the building. It started with my elderly neighbor Melissa and how one day her pet Persian cat vanished from her apartment. And the sickness that took my roommate's life also began manifesting itself throughout the building, with no possible cure being achievable. It first appeared in the elderly residents, starting with Melissa, and gradually 5 elderly residents succumbed to the disease with high fevers that were incapable of being lowered. But then the sickness was transferred to the children of the apartment. The worst case involved a young single mother whose infant son contracted it, and despite her enlisting doctors to help her son, he faded away the next day. I received more notes from Brunette each day about the various people he had played with. He was a busy boy because I raked up 30 notes detailing his many endeavors. It became clear to me that I was cursed by Brunette because of my incessant refusal to fall to his commands, and my curse was bringing bad luck to my neighbors. If I didn't do anything immediately, I was afraid that his influence would then transfer over to my family. I didn't know if I could live with myself if something happened to my nieces or nephews or my aging parents. The most disgusting message I received from Brunette, though, was regarding Blondie's fate. When I managed to leave my apartment room to buy groceries, Brunette left a note on my floor mat by simply saying, "Look inside your cupboard." I did what the boy ordered me, and was given the shock of my life. Inside was Blondie's head, bloody and still. Those black eyes still unnerved me greatly, but that was mostly because they were truly devoid of all life. Inside of his mouth was a message. "He tried to come between you and me. He tried to ruin my fun, so I had to make him go away." Reading the letter sent a chill down my spine. To think he was so bent on getting back at me that he'd kill his only semblance of a friend was horrible. From there, I became more determined to stop Brunette from tormenting me and infecting the other apartment neighbors with the sickness. Researching the cases involving the black-eyed kids was tenuous at best, because most of them consisted of the same basic rhetoric. These entities knocking on people's doors or car windows and demanding entry only to become enraged when they are denied. No case resembled mine in the slightest. I then decided to look up good luck charms that could act as a barrier against Brunette. I did find this one curious nursery rhyme, though. Old Father Longlegs can't say his prayers. Take him by the left leg and throw him down the stairs. And when he's at the bottom, before he long has lain, take him by the right leg and throw him up again. I was certain I'd heard that rhyme before, or at least the melody. One day I got desperate enough to visit a shaman outside of my town, who told me that he was very familiar with beings like Brunette. He stated that he saw them every time he went into a trance induced by a cocktail of hallucinogens. Despite my devotion to not being a drug user, I was desperate to try anything to rid myself of this sickness. I took a deep whiff of the drug, and before I even knew it, I was walking on a path that was unwinding. I trudged forward endlessly until I saw Brunette standing there in his typically lifeless stance. His head was bowed, but he sensed that I was there. "You finally came to play with me," he said in that same dull, monotonous tone. "After tormenting me for weeks, scaring my dog half to death, killing my roommate, and then your own friend, and then cursing me, all I want to know is what you are." Brunette casually brushed my request aside. He walked closer to me and readied his hand. Like the first time we had met, he had a look of hunger on his face. Whatever it was made clear that what was motivating Brunette was the need to feed on my soul. He was back to his olive skin tone and skinnier than I remembered. Did he really decide that playing with me was more important than acquiring sustenance? Whatever the motivation, I grabbed his arm and clamped down on it. "Let me go," Brunette hissed. I refused and applied more pressure to his arm. His bones were surprisingly fragile, no doubt from not harvesting souls for a long time. He wiggled around under my hand, certainly feeling the bones in his hand breaking like twigs. I took my other hand and hit him with it. Before I could strike him again, he hypnotized me with his eyes. I felt myself slipping into a dark abyss with my strength weakening. "That was no fair. No fair," Brunette muttered. There I was, sprawled on my back, looking up at the black-eyed boy. He bent down to my face and a smile flared. His lips formed into an O shape, which he used to forcefully begin to inhale air. A vapor escaped my open mouth and entered his. My soul was rejuvenating him once more, his skin regaining a healthy, peachy hue. My body grew weaker. If I didn't do anything, Brunette would leave me as a hollow husk and continue to ensnare and terrorize more innocent victims. With the last of my strength, I shot my hand out and seized him by his lips. He immediately knew what I was trying to do and doubled down on me. I fought back, pushing his face away from mine. Brunette groaned in pain and his chest began to descend. I took that opportunity to hit him in his ribcage a couple of times until he was forced to let me go. Purple blood was seeping out of his mouth in a wheeze. He looked up at me like I was the most disgusting thing in the room. "You'll die in here, you know, like your buddy and all of the others." He laughed in a haze. I was becoming more enraged by the minute. I wasn't willing to give this little brat any more of my time. With one more punch, I hit him directly in his demonic face, and he was sent off the path. The path acted as a bridge between the conscious and subconscious world. Underneath was a heavy mist. I wasn't even sure if it led to anywhere in particular. Brunette plummeted off the path, disappearing into the mist. His small frame fluttered in the wind, and he disappeared. I woke up from my trance not too long afterward. I never saw him again. I couldn't even begin to explain to anyone else what had happened, let alone that there was a head of a black-eyed boy in my cupboard, which also mysteriously disappeared. But with his disappearance, my curse began to vanish. It didn't disappear overnight, mind you, but nevertheless, the sickness ended, and no one else in my apartment was struck with an incurable disease. But with him, I could never be too careful. While I hope that he's still falling, I investigated collecting good luck charms of any kind to prevent him from returning. I've also acquired a new job, and I saw to it that I only worked during the day shift. With my suspicions that Brunette was still watching me somewhere out there and waiting for his next move, I could never be too careful.